Listen-only mode.
Okay, that might help. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. We're going to look at feedback tools today, and what I might do just to get things rolling is you'll notice over on the right-hand side there's a question box. Could you just type in clear, just to indicate that I'm coming across loud and clear, because the last thing I want to do is be talking to myself. So could you just type in, yeah, great, thank you. Thanks, Cecil. Thank you. Okay. Sounds as if I'm coming across well. So brilliant. All right. Welcome to the webinar, and I'm going to take you through some of the important tools around giving feedback. And at any stage during the presentation, if you've got questions or you've got comments that you'd like to make, then what you can do is just go to that question box over on the right hand side and just type in your comment or your question. And what I'll do is I'll stop the broadcast at different times and take your comments and take your questions. That way we can make this as interactive as possible. And so I just encourage you to do that. So don't be shy, put your comment or question in there, because I'll be throwing a lot of information at you in the next hour, that's for sure. Okay, so let's get underway. I'm just going to get rid of my screen. Well, I'll leave it on, but I just need to get rid of that. Okay. All right, so let's have a look at what we're going to be covering in this topic. And I want to cover some of the findings that are out there about feedback, because some of the findings are very interesting and quite sobering, I might say. So we'll have a look at some of the findings around feedback and what employees are saying and what managers are saying as well. I want to talk about you or anybody else that you're leading, how they might manage expectations. It's quite a complex topic, and I do want to talk about managing expectations and take a little bit of time out to go through that. I'll share with you some tools, of course, and that's why you're here, some tools for giving effective feedback. And I'll end up talking about the 5 conversations framework, which is one of many frameworks that you can use in order to give feedback and also to get feedback as well from your employees. And that'll take us right up to the top of the hour. All right, so let's have a look at some interesting information in relation to feedback, which you might find useful. What you're looking at here, and it should be coming up on your screen now. Yep, it's gone again. There it is. It's gone again. There it is. So let's talk about this very simple bar chart. So what you've got there is up the top, you can notice it says receive strength-based feedback. So if, and this is research done of employees, so when employees feel that they're getting strength-based feedback only, in other words, you're talking about positive feedback, you're giving people encouragement, you're giving people support, you're coaching people, that sort of feedback. When we're talking about that, what it's basically saying is that you are going to do a lot of good in relation to engaging employees. So in other words, being positive in your feedback is going to be very useful, because the blue is the engaged and the red is the disengaged. So obviously the more blue, the better. So obviously that would be a good start. And one of the simplest things you could do out of this webinar is come out of this webinar and go off and give 3 bits of positive feedback each day to your particular team. Now, this is where it gets interesting. If you look at the second bar, it shows that if all a person receives is critical feedback, so in other words, it's just negative feedback, you're pulling up people who haven't achieved your expectations, you're explaining why, but there's no positive feedback at all, it's just negative. You will notice that the blue bar has got shorter, but it's still reasonably engaged. So in other words, giving negative feedback is still engaging. Obviously, it depends on how you do it. But what I think is the most interesting on this screen is at the bottom where it says, if an employee receives no feedback at all, none, not positive, not negative, you will notice it will disengage employees. So the message, I think, is very simple and very clear, and that is, as long as we give feedback on performance in our workplaces, we will to some extent engage our employees. Or perhaps more starkly, if we don't do that, we will actually disengage employees. Okay? So negative feedback is better than no feedback. That's basically the message out of that screen. So you can see that if we're really looking at engaging people, then they need to know where the crossbar is. They need to know what your expectations are, and that's precisely what feedback does. So here is some more interesting information about feedback that you might find useful. That if we look at roughly a 3-to-1 margin, employees believe that constructive feedback does more to improve their performance. Constructive feedback does more to improve their performance than positive feedback. What people are actually saying is that they want to know when they're not going well. They need to know when they haven't met your expectations. So people are really, the interesting thing about this is that not everybody likes negative feedback, but what people are basically saying is that they need negative feedback when it's done the right way. And of course, we'll go through how we do that shortly. So the secret of having employees listen to your feedback is basically whether or not they actually respect you. And I think any leader is in the business of being respected rather than liked. So our job is to be respected. Now, obviously, we know that respect is earned, and it's incredibly hard to get. It takes a long time to get respect, and it can be lost very quickly, as we know. One incident or not following through on something. And all of this means that we as leaders need to be authentic. So we need to be true to ourselves, not trying to put on some facade. So respect is critically important in the context of whether or not your feedback is listened to or not. So basically what that means also is that you could have exactly the same thing said by two different people and get completely different effects. So in other words, just because we give feedback, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be useful or effective. But a lot of it has to do with the degree of respect that you have from the person that's receiving the feedback, whether it's positive or negative. So all of these tools and all of the things that I'm sharing with you are basically useless unless, of course, you are well regarded and well respected by the people that you lead. So that's critically important. Now, I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on performance reviews, but sometimes the only feedback that people actually get is from performance reviews. And incidentally, you'll be getting a copy of all of these slides at the end of this, so just relax and enjoy yourself. You'll also be getting a video recording of this as well. But let's have a look at some of the interesting data around performance reviews. And those of you who know my work would be well aware that I'm very much against the whole notion of performance reviews, because I think what happens is that we save up all our feedback for this one big event once a year, and then we dump all of this feedback on people when in fact we should have been doing that along the way. But you notice some interesting figures. 30% of the performance reviews end up decreasing employee performance, right? 30% decreasing, not maintaining, but actually decreasing. 58% of executives believe that their current program doesn't result in performance or engagement. That's a pretty big margin. 70% of companies are now reconsidering their performance strategy. And this is happening all over the world, and you may have seen some of the bigger multinational companies such as Google and Accenture and a couple of others are actually getting rid of their performance reviews and replacing it with some sort of a conversation model. And I'll share one of those with you in the presentation today. 2 out of 3 employees with the highest performance scores aren't actually the highest performers. So sometimes these ratings that we give people are really not terribly accurate. And I find that people will often rate people just to appease them. So, you know, if you've got a 5-point scale, you might rate people a 3, but we never give 5s and we very rarely give 1s. So what it means is that really ratings aren't any way objective whatsoever. So sometimes we delude ourselves into thinking that ratings actually lead to higher levels of objectivity. They don't. 6% of companies surveyed think performance reviews are worth the time. Only 6. That means a whopping 94% are either ambivalent or believe that they actually don't help. 2% of HR executives say yearly evaluations are useful. 2%. So a whopping 98% think they're not useful, at least. That's a serious indictment on the performance review. 80% of workers are dissatisfied with the performance reviews. 80% of people who are on the receiving end of performance reviews think that they are a waste of time. And 3 to 5% improvement in performance all managers believe will be generated in the process. So only 3% of people think that the review actually assists in performance development. I can tell you now that there's no research that I've come across anywhere over a long period of time that demonstrates conclusively that performance reviews actually increase performance. So my question is really, why do we bother doing them? I think we should be doing reviews or at least having performance conversations daily. And this is about feedback. So you can see that the performance review is seen in a dim light, not only by managers, but also the people receiving it and even some people in HR as well. So there's some pretty damning statistics there. And I think it all points in the direction of a need to be giving regular and constant feedback. I want to talk a little bit about the whole notion of managing expectations, because at the end of the day, what we're really talking about here is exactly that. It's about managing the expectations that you have of the people that you lead. Now, there's a couple of key questions that have to be answered in this process. So one of the key, or the first fundamental question that we've got to be able to answer as a leader is, what are my expectations as a leader? So are you clear about your expectations of what other people should and should not do in your industry? Are you very clear about that? Now, you might say, yes, I am, but you know, really think hard about that. Are you clear about all of the dimensions of what people do? That's the fundamental starting point, because obviously if you're not clear about that, then it's hardly likely that you're going to be able to manage the expectations that you have of other people. Once we're clear about our own expectations, we have another question that we need to be able to answer. And that question is, have I actually communicated these expectations to my team? All right. So it's one thing having them in your head. It's actually another thing communicating them to your team. Now, obviously, by giving people feedback, you're actually communicating those expectations to your team by virtue of giving feedback on performance. So this is something that can never be done you can never do too much of this. The whole concept of communication is to be consistent and persistent. So communicating your expectations regularly, moment by moment, incident by incident, project by project, employee by employee. So if we have our expectations and we've communicated them, the next big step is, does the person on the receiving end of your communication of expectations, do they actually understand your expectations? That becomes a critically important question. So it's one thing for you to have them, it's another thing for you to communicate them, but do people actually understand what your expectations are? And sometimes people will just nod dutifully and really they don't have a clue of what you're actually expecting of them. So obviously, unless they understand what those expectations are, they can hardly be expected to meet them, at least consistently because they don't know what they are. So what's the next question? The next question that we've got to be able to answer is, do my team members accept my expectations? All right, so it's one thing for them to know what that is. It's another thing for them to understand it, but yet another thing completely for them to accept those. So for example, if we're setting budgets for salespeople, we've communicated those budgets and people actually understand what those budgets mean, but they may not accept them. They might think that they're just too unrealistic. So that therein lies the problem of expectation. They just don't believe that they can meet them. The next question we've got to ask is, are my team members, the word there should be, sorry, that's a typo, are my team members permitted to meeting those expectations? So the next big key question is, are they given the resources and the time and the support needed to meet those expectations? So it's no good, for example, putting deadlines on reports if people are very lackadaisical about getting information to those employees so that they can complete their report to your satisfaction. I mean, obviously, in that case, they're not going to be able to meet your time deadline because there are other variables in the organisation that are preventing them from getting that information to you. Do your team members know how they're performing against those expectations? So the next big question is, do they know where the line in the sand is? Do they actually know whether or not they're hitting the targets or whether they're not? Now, obviously, when it comes to targets, numbers, it's of course a lot easier for people to actually know whether they're meeting the targets or not. But in some particular areas, it's not quite so easy. So in order for people to know whether they're meeting those targets, they need to be given regular feedback. And that's, of course, critically important and what we're really on about today. And then, of course, they need to be given the support to achieve those expectations. So if they just don't have the necessary knowledge or skills or even attitude to be able to meet those expectations, then that's going to be problematic. So you and me as the leader have to give people the support tools they need in order to meet those expectations and to hit those targets as much as humanly possible. So you can see it's quite a complex set of questions around expectations. It's not a simple matter. And the thing is, if any of those questions are missing or we can't definitively answer a yes to any of those questions, it's highly likely that there's going to be a problem in managing expectations at the team member level. Okay. So what I want to do now is, and of course, as I said, if you've got any questions or comments or statements or anything like that, please type them in on the question box over on the right-hand side, and I will certainly stop and answer those at any time because that helps to get you engaged in the process. So what I want to do now is talk about timing. Well, not just timing. I want to actually talk about some of the attributes that are critically important in order to give good feedback. And when I say good feedback, I'm talking positive or negative, any feedback. So timing is critically important, and I find that the sooner after an event or a situation that you give feedback, the better. Why? Because it's current, it's contextual, it obviously demonstrates some degree of importance that you place on that person meeting that expectation. Think about it this way. Imagine if you had a performance review with one of your team members and you said to them, I just wanted to mention to you that that report that you gave to the management team 6 months ago was really great. I didn't get a chance to talk to you about it at the time, but I'm just taking this opportunity to let you know that I was very happy with the way you gave that feedback, that report. Now, the person on the receiving end of that feedback is probably going to, well, I guess they'll appreciate the feedback to a certain level, but they're also probably thinking in their mind that if it was that important, if it was that stunning, if that sort of presentation was so great, then you would have said something to me at the time, but you didn't. So timing's critical, and of course the same with negative feedback. So for example, if somebody is being negative in a meeting and really probably shooting down everybody's suggestion, and you leave it for several months, and then you find that you can't take it anymore, and you sit down with the person and say, look, every time we have a team meeting, I find that every time somebody comes up with an idea, you tend to want to shoot it down. Now, if you do that, what you're actually doing is really saying to the other person, well, you know what? It really wasn't all that important, because if it was that important, I would have done it, the first time, or I would have done it earlier. I would have nipped it in the bud. So timing's critical. Now, I know this isn't always easy because we're all busy people and sometimes you can't actually give timely feedback, but my suggestion to you is that the moment you can give people feedback, you do so. So timing is absolutely critical to the success of feedback and how effective it is going to be registered with the person receiving the feedback. Now, another very important attribute of good feedback is the need to be very specific with people. So it's no good just being general and saying, look, you gave a great presentation, or the way you handled that customer complaint was fantastic. I mean, it's too generalized. You need to be very specific about what the feedback's about so that people actually grasp clearly what you're giving them feedback on. Again, whether it's positive or negative. So we're going to just explore this a little bit more because it's critically important that you give feedback. The very best way to give feedback, incidentally, is using a critical incident. So something that's actually happened or not happened in the workplace is the perfect opportunity to give specific feedback because it's fresh in the mind of the person who was involved in it. Perhaps you observed it, and so you can talk about it. So let's talk a little bit about being specific in terms of the feedback that we give people. A couple of key points. Okay, so make your feedback specific. So if you said to somebody, for example, that overall good job on the presentation at this morning's meeting, but it could have been better. So that's your feedback. That's too generalized. And what that means is that the person's wondering, well, I wonder what you liked about it. And what's this business about what you could have done better? So you're leaving the person wondering where the line in the sand is. It's not clear, but it's just vague. So how about we try something different? How about we try something like this? How about we say this? Great job on the presentation. I really like the way you use statistics to back up your key points. One small comment, maybe for next time, you could invite more comments from the group to get them more involved. Do you see the difference? Do you see how much more effective the specific feedback is? Which requires you to think a little bit around the feedback and to think, what did you actually like about it? What didn't you like? And to actually feed that back to the person. So being timely is important, and also being specific is important as well. Now, another important attribute or dimension of feedback is actually the concept of frequency. And what I mean by frequency means that feedback is ongoing, day by day, moment by moment, critical incident by critical incident, situation by situation. It's an ongoing project. It never ends. So, your feedback is an ongoing dialogue that's punctuated by other work being done. So the very top managers we find, the top leaders in the 21 industries that I work in, one of their common attributes, and I guess they've got a few common attributes, but one of their common attributes is the fact that they are willing and do find the time and the space to be giving regular feedback on performance, both positive and negative. So we have to get into this thinking that this is actually our job. It's not just about saving it all up for the big performance review event at the end of the year or perhaps twice a year. It's moment by moment, situation by situation. And I think some of you might be thinking, well, you know what? I just don't have the time for all this feedback. Some of this feedback will only take literally seconds. It doesn't need to be a long, down tools 1 hour meeting. It's not about that. In fact, the shorter, the more specific, the more timely, and the more frequent it is, the better. Okay? So it's really important that frequency becomes a critically important issue in feedback. And that's why I think the performance review mitigates against that, because we save it all up for that big event. Now, another concept that's really important is the capacity for you to ask questions. And what I mean by that is that, your job really in feedback is not to sit there and eloquently run through a kind of commentary about what you've seen. Part of the whole notion of feedback is to ask incisive questions. The questions that start with why, what, who, where, how, and which. Of course, they are open-ended questions and they precipitate a more than a yes or no. So, for example, if I was giving someone feedback, I would, and I often do, will actually start by saying, how did you think you went in that exercise? Or how did you think the project went? Or how did you feel the task went? I want to get their feedback first. And there's only three possibilities. Either their feedback and my feedback are exactly the same and we can agree, or their feedback and my feedback are pretty much the same, but there's some variation, of which I will give some additional feedback. And there's another case where the feedback that they give me about their own performance and my own view of their performance are different. And if that's the case, you just simply say, we'll have to agree to disagree. There are a few things that I'd like to talk to you about. All of this is prefaced on the idea that feedback is a conversation that's based on a series of questions, because at the end of the day, all you're trying to do in feedback is to change people's thinking so that ultimately what happens is you change their behaviour. And the very best way to change somebody's thinking, if you think about it, is by asking an open-ended question and getting them to actually reflect on that. Sometimes you won't get a win during the feedback meeting. You might actually say to the other person, I'd want you to go away and reflect on what I've said. Would you be prepared to do that? Sometimes the light bulb moment, if you like, will happen after you've given the feedback while they're reflecting away from you. Another concept or dimension about feedback that I think misunderstood quite a lot is the notion of privacy. My personal view is that feedback should be done in private. And you might say, well, I've heard this saying, praise in public and criticise in private. I think personally, I think that both, whether it's negative or positive, should be done in private. The fact of the matter is some people really don't like being made the centre of attention during a team meeting. They're quiet, they're reserved, they just want to do a good job. They want you, of course, to acknowledge that, but they don't necessarily want they want all the attention drawn to them. So have a think about that. It's often a better scenario or situation to do it in private. Obviously, it's not always easy, and it's not always easy because we're right in the middle of things, or we have people floating around in the office. It's not always easy to be able to give that feedback. But, the moment you get a private moment, that's when you should be giving the feedback. Now, another very important dimension of feedback is that feedback should be based, I think, on a critical incident or series of critical incidents. Now, all that simply means is that you're looking for observable examples that you can share with the other person so that you can articulate and reinforce your particular expectations of that person. That becomes how you do that rather than making generalizations. I've just got a question here, I notice, about if you haven't observed the critical incident, how can you give feedback on it? That's a good question, John. If you haven't observed the critical incident, but you've heard about it, then just get the other person to talk about it. Just get them to articulate what they got from that situation. What can they do differently? Notice the questions, they're open-ended. If you had your time over again, how might you have approached that situation differently? That's the sort of thing that I'm talking about. So critical incidents become really important. Now, another dimension about feedback is to focus on the future. At the end of the day, the only reason that you're giving any feedback at all, or should be, is basically so that you can make sure that either the person continues that positive behaviour the next time they're faced with a similar circumstance, or not to continue that behaviour next time. It's not about blame, criticism, or anything like that. That has nothing to do with it. That doesn't mean necessarily the other person won't accept it as criticism, but it's all in the delivery, of course. But all you're trying to do is to make sure that that behaviour does not happen again in the future. So you might actually say to someone, look, what's happened. We can't change that. But what I'm really keen about is to help you to perhaps think a little bit differently about it the next time you're faced with that situation. Would you be prepared to do that for me? You see, so what you're doing is you're getting a commitment from the other person that they will attempt to do whatever they can to make sure that that circumstance does not happen again in the future. That's all you're doing with feedback. It's important to understand that. So let's just change tack now, and I'd really be keen to just talk about some guidelines for conversations on poor performance, because let's face it, when you have to give negative feedback about performance, that's probably the most challenging form of feedback that you and I will face. So let's actually consider some of the issues around that. The very first thing you should do when you are faced with somebody who is performing poorly on a consistent basis is to get straight to the point. I don't mean hit them right between the eyes, but don't bother with small talk. I mean, at the end of the day, if you've booked a room or you've got some space where you can sit down with them, don't ask them about how things are going in their work area. Don't ask them about their family. Just get straight to the point. And what I suggest, why? Because they're sitting there anxiously wanting to know what they're there for. So the longer you leave it, the greater the tension will rise in the room, and the more difficult it'll be for you, one, to get to the point, but two, to accept your point. So just get out there and say what it is that you want to talk to them about. And my advice to you is to think carefully about the words that you're going to use. And I would suggest to you that the first words that you utter are the most critical words in a performance conversation. So even if you have to get, and I've done this myself, get a pen and paper out and actually write down what are the words that I can use to accurately reflect my concern about their poor performance in that situation. Now, I'm not talking about sugarcoating it. I'm not talking about making it diplomatic or anything like that. I just want you to be crystal clear about what it is that you want to talk to them about. Really, really important. Remember my comment about specifics? So it's no good sitting down saying, I want to talk to you about your rotten attitude. Well, that's really not going to be a very effective conversation. But if you wanted to sit down with us and say, I want to talk about the last 4 meetings that you and I attended and your contribution to those 4 meetings, particularly with regard to the positive ideas that others raised and your reaction to that. You see, so I'm much more specific about it and I can move on from there. Another key thing, and I guess I've kind of gone through this already, is to explain the purpose of the meeting. The purpose of the meeting, or the reason that I've asked you to come in here, or what I want to talk to you about is blah, blah, blah. So just get straight to the point and let the person know why they are there, because you owe it to them. It's a dignified thing to do, and you don't want them sitting there scratching their head thinking, what's all this about? I've got work to do. Now, what I strongly recommend that you do is that once you have explained the purpose of the meeting, you've got straight to the point, is to shut up and bite your tongue until it bleeds. And what I think you should do then is ask them to critique their own performance. So what do you think about what I just said? Or what's your reaction to what I just mentioned to you? And then your job is to keep quiet and encourage the other person to comment. And frankly, it doesn't matter whether they agree with you or disagree with you, or neither disagree nor agree with you. Just get them talking. Get yourself off the hook. And another key point in all of that is bite your tongue until it bleeds. The critically important point here is you are not to interrupt them when they're making their contribution, having been offered the opportunity to have their contribution. So if you interrupt them, then why can't they interrupt you? I know that's easier said than done, because sometimes people will say things that are completely and blatantly inaccurate, and you're sitting there thinking, I really need to correct that. Just sit there quietly and listen, maintain steady eye contact, and then at the conclusion of what they've said, say, look, there's a couple of things there I want to respond to, right? Which basically gives you the moral high ground, because when you want to actually talk and they interrupt you, you can say with great justification, stop. I've given you an opportunity to say what you wanted to say. I would appreciate the same opportunity to do that. So those, to me, are the critically important early points. There are a few other things that you might like to consider in these difficult performance conversations. You are not entertaining an argument. You are not having an argument. In fact, that doesn't mean the other person doesn't think it's an argument, or indeed even wants it to be an argument. But my point to you is that you should avoid confrontation. This is not about you confronting them. In fact, 2 very good sayings, well used sayings, are, we will just have to agree to disagree. That's quite a powerful way of diffusing an argument. Or the other thing that you could say is, explain why you disagree with that, and get them to elaborate on that. So don't go there, or just say to them, I refuse to argue with you about this, or I refuse to have a confrontation with you about this. Just diffuse it early, because that's not the point. It's not about a battle of wills. The other thing that's important, of course, is to focus on performance. And what I mean by that is that this is about their performance. And that's why critical incidents are so powerful, because what you're actually doing is you're focusing on the situation, the circumstances, what you observed. So it's not about anything else other than performance. So your feedback is not about the person, it's actually about the person's performance. It becomes critically important. I mentioned this earlier, and it's really important we keep this in mind, that your job is to focus on the future, right? So it's, if they start wanting to talk about the past and to make excuses and point the finger of blame and anything else that they might choose to do, your job is simply to say to them, look, what's happened's happened. What I'm really interested in is to make sure that this doesn't happen again. So let's talk about how we might make this, or how we might ensure that this does not occur again, because frankly, if I didn't think it was important, I wouldn't be sitting down with you. So focus very much on the future. And another thing you can do in these difficult performance conversations is balance it up. Every single person has some innate talent or strength, and I think it's really important to make sure that it's not all negative, even to the point of you saying, I am very confident that you will be able to, eliminate this from your work, or I'm pretty confident you can make sure that this doesn't happen again, or I'm pretty confident you'll check your facts next time. I'm actually affirming to the other person that I believe in them. And that's important because obviously if you were sitting there giving them feedback, you wouldn't be doing it, would you, unless you felt quite genuinely that they themselves could change their behaviour. Otherwise you're wasting your time. So it's really important for you to emphasise that you believe in their capacity to be able to change their behaviour. And finally, seek out the causes. Don't just take things on face value. Ask questions. Ask people why. Why did this happen? What happened then? Who did you talk to? When did it take place? And if you're worried about sounding like a detective, then my suggestion is to ask the question, do you mind if I ask you a couple of questions so that I understand the situation perfectly? That's a question. And you're likely to get a yes or a grunt at least. And once you get that affirmation, you can then start to ask a bunch of questions in order to elicit certain responses. That can be very powerful. All right, so I want to now just have a quick, I want to give you a framework. Some of you might have seen this before, and I apologise if I'm going over old ground, but by all means, ask me any questions that you might have about the framework. I call this the 5 conversations framework for the simple reason that there are 5 conversations. Each of these conversations, these 5, should go for about 10 to 15 minutes. That's what they've been designed to do. And each, as you'll notice on the left-hand side, each conversation occurs once a month. So the whole purpose of the exercise is to have one of these conversations each month with your team. So, for example, in month 1, I'm going to have a climate review conversation. Now, what does that mean? Well, that talks about job satisfaction, it talks about morale, and it talks about communication. So my very first question in that conversation would be this. On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being high, 1 being low, how do you rate your current job satisfaction? All right, so I've given them an opportunity to give me a number, and they might say 6. And then my next question, as you could probably work out, is why? Why a 6? And then I might then say to them, okay, if it's a 6, what do I need to do as your leader to get it from a 6 to an 8? All right. And then you might say there's a couple of things that I think would be very useful from my perspective as well that I'd like to share with you. So you've got that incredible communication connection there that around job satisfaction. So it's not a difficult conversation to start with. In month 2, we talk about people's strengths and talents. So what are people actually good at? Instead of us going straight for the jugular and looking at all the negative things that people do, how about we start with an upward spiral of positivity? How about we actually start looking at what people are actually innately talented at? And let's face it, everyone's got talent in some respect. It's a matter of us working out what it is, and then considering how we might utilize that more effectively in their current role, or indeed in future roles in the organization. So we've created an upward spiral, as I say, of positivity. And so by the time we get to month 3, we're going to talk about opportunities for growth. Now, opportunities for growth would imply, of course, that we're talking about people's weaknesses, and that's precisely what we're doing. So there are always things that all of us have to improve upon, all of us. So my strong suggestion is that and of course you can understand that month 3 is probably the most challenging of the 5 conversations, but nevertheless, it's an important conversation to have. But by having the first 2 conversations to start with, we're kind of getting warmed up. Then in conversation number 4, which is the learning and development conversation, you're able to take the strengths, you're able to take the opportunities for growth, and therefore start to talk about how you could develop people's strengths and how might you overcome or at least minimize their weaknesses. So this is not about sending people off to courses necessarily. It could well be about you showing people how to do things. It could well be about you giving people additional information. It could be about coaching. It could be about mentoring. But it's really about learning and development, and in a broader sense. So it's about the way you can support people to meet your expectations in their current role. And the last conversation in month 5 is around innovation and continuous improvement. So how can we make our organisation or our team more efficient and effective is the critical focus. So conversation 4 is about them and how you can support them. And conversation 5 is about how they can support the team by coming up with ways and means of doing things more effectively, faster, easier, with less cost. I mean, the list goes on. So I'm actually expecting people to come to conversation 5 with some ideas. So the key for this framework, and if you'd like more information about it, please contact me via email, and I'm more than happy to run through in more detail how this works, because I can see this in 2 capacities. One is it's an enabler to have a better performance review conversation, or 2, it replaces the performance review completely. And organisations are using it all over the world for both of those reasons. So there's a framework, there's a set of tools that might be very effective for you when it comes to talking about people's development as such. And obviously throughout those 5 conversations, you're going to have people who are, you'll have opportunities where you can actually talk about your expectations around performance. And in fact, I'd encourage you to do that. That's the whole purpose of the exercise as such. All right, moving right along. So, guys, we've got a few minutes for questions, other questions. I've got a question here from Judy. Do the 5 conversations only have to last 15 minutes, or can they go longer? Great question, Judy. Judy, they can go longer, and sometimes they should go longer. But they're designed, in other words, there's only a few key questions around each. They're designed to go for 15 minutes because, we all recognise that people are busy, and having regular conversations, shorter conversations with people is a far better way to go than have one big long meeting, as I said earlier, at the end of the year. Having said that, there is a time and a place where there's a complete misunderstanding or it's a relationship building conversation. In those sort of circumstances, my strong advice to you would be it's okay to have a longer conversation, but that's because you know that it's productive. But I don't think they're designed to be going, necessarily for hours on end. Okay, I've got a couple of other questions here. So thank you, guys. That's good. I like questions. Cecil asks, organisations really like to keep record of conversations for record purposes. Okay, you're right. Record purposes. Sorry, how do we do that without creating bureaucracy? Yeah, great question. Look, the key thing there is, in fact, if you're interested in the 5 conversations, I actually do have an online system which allows people to record So the employee, when they come to the conversation, actually prepares by writing their responses to each of the questions, so that by the time the conversation occurs, they've thought carefully about the conversation. So in other words, if they're looking at the innovation and continuous improvement conversation, they in fact have already thought about a suggestion of how to make the business more efficient and effective. And then after the conversation, the manager then has an opportunity to go in and add his or her comments as well. So yes, I do believe there's a place for that, absolutely, but I don't think it should be done in any legalistic way where we can hold a gun to people's head. It's really about keeping a record for reference. It's really about helping people prepare for the conversations, and it's really about the manager being thoughtful in reflection about those conversations. So it's really about that. It's not just documenting things for the sake of it, which of course, Cecil, you're alluding to in the question. It's not about all that. And of course, as we all know, the performance review is just riddled with paperwork, and in some cases I've heard people say that they didn't make eye contact once during the performance review because their manager was too busy filling out all this mindless paperwork. So it's not about that. In fact, the magic of this is, and I think you're alluding to that, Cecil, the key thing about this is the conversation, right? It's not the documentation. But I also acknowledge that sometimes it's a good idea for us to actually record that in some shape or form. Okay, how many of these conversations need to be formally documented? Okay, another documentation question. Look, I think I probably answered that one. I think, look, if it's a performance management issue, in other words, you're actually into that performance management phase, of course, you've got to dot the I's and cross the T's, and of course, you've got to document things. Absolutely. I have no problem with that. In fact, it's really quite important to do that. And in fact, I'd encourage you to do that. But my point is that it's about communication, not documentation, right? So, you're giving someone feedback. I don't really think you need to be documenting that. You're having a conversation with someone that's encouraging. You're encouraging them to do a better job and such and such. You don't need to document that, right? And if you're having regular conversations, monthly, for example, you won't need to document things. It'll just get in the way. But by all means, of course, you've got to keep some documentation. So that's a fair question. All right, guys, if you've got any others, I can squeeze another question in. But while we're thinking about that, I just want to just let you know that I have a Lunch and Learn series, and I know some of you have sponsored people to go on this. This Lunch and Learn series is very popular. It's basically 6 modules, and you can see them in front of you there. I'm certainly not going to run through them all, but at the end of the day, it means that the person can plug in for an hour. They get 6 hours on each, 1 hour on each of those topics, usually spread out a couple of weeks between each. There's a couple of diagnostics to fill out, and they can complete that. So the great advantage of the Lunch and Learn is that you're not paying people for travel costs. They can do this over a sandwich at their desk, basically, over lunch. So it can be very, very powerful. So if you're interested in that, I haven't got dates there, but I've got courses that are set up for the rest of the year. What I strongly suggest you do is to make contact with me, and I'll send you a flyer, and you can plug people into that process, or perhaps you might yourself be interested in being involved. So there we go. We've got another question here. Is the Lunch and Learn synchronous? We're in different time zones. Yeah, so what would happen there, Cecil, is that it may not be lunch where you are. So what would happen is that it's probably not really lunch. It might be, 5 o'clock in the afternoon or whatever. That's okay, because if somebody, because they're attending a meeting or something, misses out, they get a recording, as you will get for this. They get a recording of the presentation plus a set of slides, and they have unlimited time with me as their coach via email. So in that sense, it is synchronous, but of course we do encourage people to be in the live presentation to get into that discipline of, you know, making sure they look after their own learning. So hopefully that helps for you to consider that. All right, so it doesn't look like we've got any other questions. One last quick plug, as this book, The End of the Performance Review, is available, and many other resources I've got available. If you're interested in a copy, a signed copy, just send me an email. I'm more than happy to send one out. But therein lies the plugs. I'd like to thank you very much for your involvement during this process, whether it's lunch or otherwise where you are. And I'd like to wish you all the very best with your feedback. And the beautiful thing about a topic like this is that you can start immediately. So whatever time it is there, off you go, and you can go off and start to have conversations around feedback. So thank you, guys. I've enjoyed working with you. And as I say, make contact with me. My email address and so forth will be made available to you. You can come back to me about the Lunch and Learn or feedback generally or the book. So thank you, and